welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9. I'm Paul Kretschmer. Today's broadcast subject is the Russell Library, its facility and future here in Middletown. I spoke with its director, Ramona Berkey.
Okay, I have Ramona Berkey on the line right now. What is your actual official title at the library, Ramona?
Thanks, Paul. My official title is the library director at the Russell Library here in Middletown.
Yeah, the library situation's a little bit different in town for me coming from the Midwest as I did, in that there's a Russell Library Company and then there's the city of Middletown. How does that relationship work in terms of your working arrangement? Does it really make much of a difference from day to day, or is it more theoretical than actual?
Well, day to day, for the day in and day out, it doesn't make too much of a difference. It is, I would say, an extra level of, oversight, since I do report directly to the Board of Trustees of the Russell Library Company. They're responsible for the governance and the oversight and strategy and finances of the library. But at the same time, because the vast majority of our funding is from the city of Middletown, we do also have to follow the financial procedures of the city in terms of purchasing and contracts and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of an extra layer of oversight.
Does it surprise you the apparent necessity for doing something really constructive with the facility that the library lives within, either at that location or elsewhere?
It's definitely not surprising. The library is approaching 150 years old as an organization. We opened it as a library in 1876. However, the building, the oldest part of the building that we exist in, had existed actually as a church on this site since 1834. So we're rapidly approaching 200 years old for the oldest part of our library facilities. And, when you're working in an early 19th century building but trying to provide 21st century library services, it's a challenge. And so our responsibility as sort of good ancestors for the folks who come after us, our generations after us, is to make a plan so that we do have a sustainable building and an accessible building for the future.
I have worked or lived in Middletown for almost 42 years now, and my earliest recollection of the Russell Library personal experience is that they were working on that building a long time ago, and I can remember when the books were inaccessible. The stacks were inaccessible to users because you had to turn in a slip of paper that had the call number on it so that someone from the library could retrieve it from storage and give it to you because the building was under renovation and you couldn't go in.
Yes, that sounds like the most recent renovation of the library, which was about 40 years ago in 1983. It was completed. And of course, that renovation was designed and completed before things like the Americans with Disabilities Act were signed into law, really before, obviously, the internet became a huge part of how we live and work and play. So that was, however, the last major construction on the library.
So for people who have seen it from the outside and wonder a little bit about the varying architectural styles of the various wings of the structure, give us an idea of how it was all pieced together. You mentioned already that the building on the very corner was originally a church, for instance.
It was, and it was actually, when it was built in 1834, it was built in the Greek Revival style, so you can actually see pictures of it on a history board outside the library right now. It was white, it had columns and sort of a flat roof. It did not actually have stained glass. The stained glass was added when Frances Russell purchased the church in the 1870s and converted it to a public library. And she was the person who added the Gothic features, so the brownstone, the peaked windows, the stained glass, etc. So that was in 1876 when when she converted the church to a library. And then in 1830, the city of Middletown paid to add the Hubbard Room wing onto the library, and that served as the children's library until the early 1970s. And at that point in time, the library acquired a bank building right adjacent to the library property. It was the First Federal Savings and Loan Bank. And that functioned as kind of a standalone building, housing the children's room for about a decade or so. And you had to go outside from the regular part of the library if you wanted to go into the children's room. And then in that 1983 construction that I mentioned, that connected all of those disparate buildings of various vintages together. And an interesting fact about the 1983 construction is it was intended to last until the year 2000. And it was kind of a temporary fix to add some space, which was sorely needed at the time. But what it didn't do is, for instance, the 1983 construction cannot actually support book stacks. Our book stacks right now are the same stacks that we've had since the 1950s. They're self-supporting stacks. Most of the stacked aisles are not ADA compliant by many, many, many inches. And even if you can get, say, a wheelchair down through the stacks, you can't actually turn around and get back out of the stacks. So it's a very serious accessibility issue. We're kind of grandfathered in because we can send staff members down to fetch things, specific things out of the aisles, but browsing really is not available to people with mobility issues. So that is a problem. And we are not able to reconfigure those stacks, and of course we can't move them to another part of the library because the floor that was built in 1983 simply is not strong enough to support them.
Yeah, my recollection is at one location fairly close to what has been the formal entrance to the building for some time now. There is an elevator, but once you get up to the level that it rises to, a person in a wheelchair, for instance, really couldn't go any further because there's stairways from that point on.
Exactly. There are stairways, and like I said, those very, very narrow aisles. The bare minimum really for library stack aisles, according to ADA, is about 36 inches. And then at the end of the aisle, you shouldn't have a dead end. You shouldn't dead end at a wall, which our stacks do. You really should have a turning space that's at least 60 inches wide at the end of that stack aisle. So we are very much out of ADA compliance when it comes to our stacks. And, that it also presents other challenges in terms of just the lighting. Even if you are not in a wheelchair and you want to browse the stacks, it's hard to get, lighting down to the bottom of the stacks when they're that narrow. It's hard. They're hard to use.
So any way you look at it, you mentioned a moment ago, compliant up to or expected to last, I should say, perhaps, until about the year 2000. So we're already looking 23 years in the rearview mirror then.
Yes, we are. Yeah, and the intent was really, and there are newspaper articles about this at the time when they were planning it in the late 70s, early 80s, that, this is the year 2000 solution. So in the 1990s, library leaders can come back and, make a more solid, longer-term plan for library facilities. That hasn't happened yet, and I hate to use a cliche, but it's overdue. And that's what we're working on right now, is let's make a solid plan for the next many decades for our public library facilities.
As far as the condition the buildings, perhaps you could say, are in at the current time, has that been mostly a philosophical resistance to doing something different, or has it been more a matter of where are we going to find the funding to really do a thoroughgoing job for this? Or is it a combination of factors?
I think it's a combination. I mean, obviously, we definitely have seen just in the past few years, what with COVID and, labor costs and supply chain issues, the cost of construction. Look, it never gets cheaper, notwithstanding, inflation, et cetera. But just in the past few years, it definitely has gone up a lot. So that's definitely a concern. It's not a reason not to make plans for the future because, like I said, nothing is ever going to get cheaper as time goes on. It's just, Middletown is very good about making plans for future facilities, whether it's schools or recreation facilities, the senior center, parks. And so this is just part and parcel with that process. And we have...
As far as that planning is concerned, could you spend just a moment or two explaining to people what the avenues are at the current time for your public to interact with you and the people you're working with in terms of where the library will be going?
Absolutely. So we recently, the Common Council approved an appropriation of $200,000 to do a very robust continuation of our feasibility and capital planning and community engagement process. And that'll occur over the course of the next, I would say, 6 to 9 months. We're in the process of finishing up a request for proposals, which will go out, and we'll hopefully get a good pool of consultants, architects replying to that. And then their job will be to have those meetings with key officials, stakeholders, members of the community, do the surveys, come up with, help us to narrow down which options might be are going to be most feasible for Middletown, and put together schematic drawings based on those. And then hopefully, ideally we'll end up with something to bring to the voters. As far as involvement and engagement goes, I would encourage people to keep an eye on the local papers, but also join our newsletter list. If you haven't gone to our website at russelllibrary.org, you can sign up for our e-newsletter there, and that will have more information. It's a weekly newsletter that comes out with information on how you can get involved in the input process.
Well, it certainly sounds like you do have the good fortune, as it were, to reside and work within a community that does look after its facilities and what it has for facilities. I say that because I can think of the middle school that was built recently. I can think of the high school, which goes a few years back before that. They're looking toward doing something about municipal building, and you're talking actively about a library. Middletown does seem to be progressive to the degree that it does take those things into account and does work one way or another through a process in order to provide what's necessary.
Yeah, and I think, Middletown recognizes, I've lived here for 25 years, and my son, was born here in Middletown and has benefited from our wonderful facilities, including our public schools. And I think Middletown and our residents recognize the power of investing in infrastructure. And, in this day and age, we're seeing a lot of, people who are suffering from loneliness and lack of connection, lack of understanding, mental health issues. A public library is incredibly powerful. It's an incredibly powerful tool that you can use to bring people together, to combat loneliness, to create, we like to say fellowship with a lowercase f in our case.
Yeah.
But really just to foster that understanding and connection, whether it's kids and families coming in for, story times or play groups or family concerts, or if it's senior citizens coming in for musical events or lectures or informational sessions on, finances or Medicare, what have you. We really run the whole gamut. That is our job, and you have to have the facilities that are accessible and safe and healthy in order to do that.
Thank you very much for the time you spent with me talking for public consumption for our public affairs program here at WIHS, then, Ramona. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My thanks once again to Ramona Berkey, the director of the public library in Middletown called the Russell Library. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049, 860-346-1049, or email to office@wihsradio.org, office@wihsradio.org. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer for the WIHS Journal. Public Affairs from 104.9 WIHS.